So this happened to Spencer, who happened to be a kid in elementary school back in 2010. He was about 10 years old at the time of this story, and he had told me this when I was 16 and said that this was something he would never forget. Spencer was 10 years old, so his parents decided to do Chuck E. Cheese for his birthday. Since Spencer does get very good grades at school, his family decided that for his birthday they would definitely have a birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. Now, Spencer and his family went to Chuck E. Cheese and everything seemed to be going very normal. They get in and they see a bunch of stuff and everything seemed to be going well. However, though, it wasn't until a few days later where something went wrong on the day they went to Chuck E. Cheese. It was a blustery September evening, so it was around close to the time when fall was approaching, so this honestly definitely was something that it was to be expected. Now, when Spencer and his family got in, they got settled in and they were going to be playing at the areas as well as playing video games. However, though, everybody was having a fun time. However, though, just as Spencer was sliding down the slide and getting his tickets, he sounded a gunshot that echoed throughout the building. Everyone stood there in shock to see that there was a man. He looked to be in his 30s. He looked like a biker guy. He had a rifle and was aiming at everyone. Of course, Spencer, as well as his parents and many of the other kids that he invited to his party, ended up evacuating as soon as the firing could be heard. However, though, the manager, who overcoming his fears, decided to step forward to confront the gunman. Of course, he eventually actually got the guy to drop his gun and knocked him out. And of course, police arrived as soon as they could, and they escorted the remaining children, parents, and everyone out of the place. By the time they had got out of there, this is when Spencer and his family had to end up postponing their party, as Chuck E. Cheese was eventually closed for at least a few weeks. It was due to the fact that since the break-in happened, they honestly do know for a fact that there is a lot of the stuff that does happen in the day. Now, Spencer lived in a place where crime rate was decently high, so that was to explain it. However, it wasn't until maybe a few days or so later when the conversation was brought up by his parents. He ended up telling his parents about what happened at Chuck E. Cheese, and honestly, his parents told him something that he didn't know. Apparently, there was a man who was in his 30s. He was a biker guy, and he was mentally unstable to the point where he went and bought a rifle and went to a Chuck E. Cheese, where he ended up opening fire at everyone. Spencer was lucky that he nor his parents or any of his friends were shot, as that would have not been good. Upon realizing that before the cops arrested him, what was really disturbing that came out of it was the fact that this man killed a couple of people. There was 4 innocent bystanders that were dead, and there was several injuries of employees and stuff. However, though, the shooter upon his capture revealed himself to be a disgruntled employee. Recently, he was let go from his job, and he outgrown a rage with the company and sought to seek revenge by arming himself and striking fear into Chuck E. Cheese. Of course, this is when he was sent to prison for life, and he was never let go. Spencer does not remember going to Chuck E. Cheese too often, as he just decides to avoid going there due to this experience. He does not know what would have happened if his parents and him did not leave Chuck E. Cheese. Eventually, Unfortunately, though, something bad would have happened if he stayed around for too long. This took place sometime in 2012 when it was closing time. A friend of mine who was 16 years old, which we will call him by Adam. Adam got a part-time job working at Chuck E. Cheese, and he mainly did the closing shifts. He didn't mind Chuck E. Cheese, as it seemed to be a pretty nice place to work at, since Adam used to go there many times as a kid. Now, as he was doing the closing shift, he was basically wiping down tables and make sure everything was cleaned up and ready for the next day. However, as he was doing his usual work at Chuck E. Cheese, he ended up hearing what sounded like someone walking around inside the interior. He eventually looked up but couldn't seem to find anybody, and the place was closed, so nobody should be in there except for the few employees who were closing everything up. He all of a sudden looked to see that there was this giant man. He looked to be in his 20s, and he eventually didn't look as if anything abnormal. He was looking like some sort of drunken person, and he ended up looking at Adam. "Oh yeah, where's the beer?" he asked. Eventually, Adam explains to him that he did know for a fact that Chuck E. Cheese does not sell beer, and escorted the man out. Surprisingly, the man didn't even try to fight him or do anything. He just willingly left the building and ended up drunkenly walked off into the day or night. He honestly had no idea why this man didn't have his car and didn't even know if he got lost. Adam ended up calling the cops, and they ended up taking his statement, and they ended up searching around to see if this man ended up having anyone that knows about him, about why he came into Chuck E. Cheese looking basically really looking like he was drunk. As it turns out, that he was drunk and ended up not remembering where everyone is. Honestly, this was not really the type of story to make you jump out of your seat, but it's later revealed that this man was on drugs when he showed up at Chuck E. Cheese. Honestly, he mistaken it for a bar, but Adam didn't even know why this guy ended up walking inside of Chuck E. Cheese. Why did he not resist him kicking him out? Honestly, he wanted to know what was this man's intentions were, but if he had some intentions, they probably were not good. He has not seen that man since that day, but he wonders, was this man dangerous or not? There was no way to know for sure if he was dangerous. However, Adam never had anything like this happen again while working at Chuck E. Cheese, and he's for sure as hell hoped that nothing like this would ever happen again. And so far, it's been a few years, nothing like that has ever happened since. So, this happened to a neighbor of mine when she was a kid. So, this took place back in 2010. She was about 8 years old at the time of the story. We'll call her Hannah. Hannah was around 8 years old, and she had a younger brother who was around 3.5. Her parents decided to take her to Chuck E. Cheese since she had been doing great with her grades, and decided that a treat would be a trip to Chuck E. Cheese. Eventually, she skipped school on that Friday just to go to Chuck E. Cheese, as it had been one of her favorites. Since this happened when she was 8 years old, it has been years since this had happened. Now, when Hannah got to Chuck E. Cheese with her parents and her brother, they ended up getting some tokens and ended up going to play some games, and they ended up watching the animatronics and stuff. However, as Hannah was playing games, there was a man who looked to be maybe in his 40s, maybe late 40s even. He walks up to her and places a hand on her shoulder. Hannah at first thought that it was her dad, but he didn't look anything like her dad. Her dad was more built than this guy. "Oh, hey there, little girl," the man said. Now, this made Hannah really unsettled, but she decided not to ignore him. Who are you? Hannah asked. The man didn't reply and basically said that he had some more tickets and stuff in his truck and that they can go and get them. Of course, before Hannah could say anything, her father, who had the personality of the teddy bear, walks up and takes Hannah close to him. The look that he gave to the man was basically saying, "Stay away from my kid." The man honestly walked away and he didn't even acknowledge anything as to what he was doing. But at the same time, he ran out of Chuck E. Cheese, went back into what seemed to be his truck, and he ended up escaping. Honestly, it really confuses Hannah, but years later, Hannah was told that this man had been trying to kidnap kids from Chuck E. Cheese, as he did that in a few locations of the place, but most of the time they had failed. Now, Hannah had not seen that man again, but of course, when she goes to Chuck E. Cheese, she is now more careful of her surroundings. She's not sure what the intentions this man had, but whatever he had in intention wise, was definitely not good. So, for a bit of context, one of the teachers went to Chuck E. Cheese when he did part time there in the summer of 2015. The teacher at the time of this story was a math teacher, and when she was off from work for a while, she took the seasonal, no, pretty much part time job at Chuck E. Cheese. She had two autistic kids, and they were both in their teen years. One was 17, the other one was 14. So she was working at Chuck E. Cheese. Since this was in 2015, she ended up was making double time with a little bit more money since the Chuck E. Cheese she went to was short staffed. However, the teacher's name, I will call her by Miss is Jacobs. As Miss Jacobs was cleaning up everything after closing night, she ended up looking up to see that there was something staring at her from the windows. At first, she thought that it could have been maybe just some random person who happened to be at the bar drunk and was looking at Chuck E. Cheese, not knowing where he or she was. But however, she went closer, and upon getting closer, there was definitely no person there. She honestly was a little she honestly was a little disturbed, but at the same time she was confused as to why would there be someone at Chuck E. Cheese this late at night, with the exception of maybe a few employees who happened to be getting everything cleaned up. She ended up just continuing to do her work. That was until she had finished her work and was going to the bathroom before he left for her that shift to end. As she was in the bathroom, she ended up hearing what sounded like someone walking into the bathroom. She called out if there was an employee who was coming to use the bathroom, but there was no voice, there was no one responding. Honestly, this really kind of confused her because who would be opening the door like that unless if it was some prank? It wasn't long until Miss Jacobs ended up hearing the laugh of a child. Honestly, she ended up getting out of the bathroom and she ended up reporting the issue and the incident to the manager, who took a look but couldn't find anyone there. However, for other employees she had told about the situation, they honestly had no idea what she was talking about. But at the same time, were confused as to why that would be the case or who would definitely be in there. It was later revealed that she he had found out that there was definitely one child who happened to have died while being stuffed into an animatronic suit by a really deranged employee. That was at least a few years ago, but honestly, Miss Jacobs did not even know if that was even true or not. She does not know who this child really was that she saw or heard, but whatever she experienced that day was completely paranormal. So this took place sometime back in 2017. This happened to one of my friends, which happened to be their names Roderick and Jesse. Roderick and Jesse were living nearby an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's, which was definitely in the US. I'm not going to say where they were in the US at the time of the story, but this was definitely something they really experienced. Since Roderick lived nearby an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese, he called Jesse and asked Jesse if he wanted to stay overnight at his house since they both didn't have school. Since, of course, Jesse agreed, they ended up going to the Chuck E. Cheese, and when they got there, they looked inside the abandoned Chuck E. Cheese. They could see that there was some furniture turned over, there was some tables and chairs, there was even some games that weren't even working anymore, littered of prizes and stuff. They honestly looked at it to see how really crazy that Chuck E. Cheese that's been abandoned for so long was. However, though, this was definitely really weird as they never seen anything like that. However, though, this is when things really got weird. When Jesse looked inside as well as Roderick, they ended up can see that they see a few shadows in the corner that looked to be as if they were human. Honestly, they called out inside if somebody was really in there, but they ended up hearing no voices or anything until a man who shows up having what seemed to be an axe and two other people who looked like they had some axes as well told them to get out. That's when Jesse and along with Roderick went back to their house, but also called the police as they said they had found a few men hiding abandoned in the abandoned Chuck E. Cheese. They obviously didn't tell the cops that they went inside the abandoned place as they were afraid that they would get in trouble. However, the cops went inside but couldn't find any of the men that were in there and said that the Chuck E. Cheese had been vacant for at most a couple years and nobody was supposed to be in there. This is when Jacob's who happened to be another friend of Roderick and Jesse, ended up saying that he saw those men had lured many teenagers into them, and honestly, they were assaulted, and one of them who happened to be brutally beaten near to death. Jesse and Roderick ended up telling Jacob that they didn't find those men when the police arrived, but they were confused as to why those men were there. That honestly sticks with them to this very day, and Roderick and Jesse never went back to the abandoned Chuck E. Cheese. Of course, Roderick moved back in 2018, while Jesse moved as well out of state in early 2019. They had never spoke about this incident, and they honestly don't know what would have happened to them if they stayed a minute or two longer with those men in axes. They're not even sure if the police had ever found them or not, but they would like to think that the police had found them, but there is no way to know for sure if the police had caught them or not. All they can hope is that they have been caught.